I always like to tell people, there is a recipe that I'll share with you in a minute, but I'd like to tell people to think of ways to keep things simple. If you want to acknowledge the Titanic foods and stories, you can do things like have a cheese assortment that is the same cheese assortment that they had every day for lunch in first class. It was the same one on all the menus that I've seen for lunch. So you could do things like that. For complicated, I would say I wasn't real thrilled with how my sauce turned out for the salmon on Thursday night.
Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspen and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries and everything else to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Join us and our special guests as we continue the 25th anniversary celebrations of Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
I'm Nelson Aspen, and it's our wonderful second season of Titanic Talk, and we're going to whet your appetite for all things Titanic tonight because we have a very delicious guest. Don't be fooled when you start craving lamb chops in the middle of this podcast, because if you're watching it on YouTube as opposed to listening to it on the other platforms, you will see our guest has a crown of delicious lamb chops behind her. But you have to go to YouTube to see that. Alexandra, who is our very special guest tonight?
Our very special guest is journalist, speaker, author, Titanic historian, and I would venture to say chief baker, Veronica Hinke, who has the most, I found her because I had to order her book, Titanic, the official cookbook, which came to me in the mail last week. And I just emailed her straight away and boom, here she is. Veronica, welcome to Titanic Talk. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you both. It's so nice to meet with you, and I was so excited to hear from you. And I'm really looking forward to our talk tonight.
Well, this book, the new book, Titanic, the official cookbook, 40 timeless recipes for every occasion, is the third of your 3 books on the Titanic. And the last night on the Titanic, I think I read some time ago. Plus, you also have Secrets of the Titanic. The million-dollar question for all of us on both sides of the camera when it comes to Titanic talk is, what initially fired up your passion for the Ship of Dreams?
Oh, I have been so blessed to be able to tell the stories that I've been accumulating since I was a kid. I have really been researching the Titanic since I was a child, and the first book came about. There's actually 2 books that I authored, and then the third book is one that I contributed to. And I was so fortunate to be able to be a part of that project. And I started researching the Titanic when I was a kid and heard about a man who lived in the town where I grew up. As a real youngster, I was in Merrill, Wisconsin. And then I moved to Wausau, Wisconsin, which was just 20 miles away or even less than that. And the man was a third-class passenger named Dan Coxon. And Dan was a popcorn vendor, and he was traveling in third class aboard the Titanic. And you can imagine, the 1970s, when I was living in this much smaller town than it is now, where no one really traveled a whole lot outside of town. I marveled at how this man would have been able to get aboard the Titanic, the Ship of Dreams, and would have sailed, from his hometown of London back to central Wisconsin the way he did. And so I wanted to learn more, and the more I found out, the more intrigued I became. About a year before the 100th anniversary of the ship, I found out about some bottles of spirits and wines and champagnes that were found at the resting site. And as a food journalist, I really wanted to tell that story, and I was able to tell it through Wine Enthusiast magazine in a real little story that came out around the 100th anniversary. And someone saw the story and contacted me to write a book about it. And I thought, how in the world? I even told this publisher who came and, literally asking me to write the book. I was so honored and pleased. And I said, I don't know how I would ever do that. How would I extrapolate this into a, 200 word story into a 200-page book, right? Well, I did it by telling the stories of the people who saved the menus, that the people who wrote the stories about the lunch that they ate. And then we tied in the recipes to create this really beautiful culinary narrative. And that first book features recipes by chefs that have interests and ties in the Titanic. And then the latest book, which just came out last week, there it is. That is my recipes, and it celebrates the movie. So it reaches out into all kinds of different recipes for movie snacks, and it acknowledges many of the immigrant stories from the Titanic. There's a Syrian recipe. There's a recipe for a pizza, which was only just recently introduced to New York City when the Titanic sailed. And of course, the Italian immigrants are so featured well in the movie with um, Jack Dawson's traveling companion.
Fabrizio.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
What I loved about it is what you've just said is that you didn't just sort of delve into historical recipes via the menu. You sort of expanded it into, okay, we're so intertwined with the movie, myself, of course, notwithstanding, and the fans that we speak to and the people we've met who just love this story, they will just absorb voraciously any information or anything that you can cast that thread back to those few nights on Titanic when they ate these amazing meals.
And Titanic aside, Veronica's story, what I love just about Titanic leading you to your book from that small article is further evidence that, first of all, you can't create luck. You either got it or you don't. There's a component of luck. It helps to be prepared, to be talented, and to be a good worker, but you got to have luck. But there's also a lesson for all of us out there that are Titanic enthusiasts. Do what you love, pursue what you love, and somehow or another, it will work itself out to become an important major part of your life. So that, there are no small stories. Look at what it's done for you. And as described, now Alexandra has the book. I don't have it yet, but I've been reading about that on the website. It's more than just recipes. You've got trivia. You've got this latest one, because it's in honor of the film, the 1997 James Cameron film, stills, pictures from the film. Tell us what's inside, in between those covers.
Well, you mentioned the games, and one of the games that I learned about researching for the book is the game of Peter Coddles, and it's a word game. It's almost like Words with Friends today that we play. It was sort of the Words with Friends game back in the Edwardian years, and it came in a little box, and it had words inside and phrases that you would work as a team, different teams working together to create sort of a improvisation story about this man named Peter Coddles who travels to New York. And kind of a neat coincidence, because the Titanic, of course, was going to New York, and this game is all based on a story of someone from the country going to New York City, which was something that everyone idealized about at that time. It was nothing like it is today, when so many people have the ability to go to New York City without even thinking much about it these days. But back then, it was just truly a triumph to be able to go to New York City, especially from Europe or London or the United Kingdom. So that game was very popular, and I really loved learning about it. Old Maid was a popular game back then, Tiddlywinks. And so we talk about that. We also talk about in the book about the customs. Calling cards were a necessity. We've gotten so far away from that calling card tradition now with Instagram and through, we all.
Yeah, what's your Instagram handle? That's all you need to know. I don't even have business cards anymore. I finally ditched the business cards altogether. Who needs them?
Yeah, you really don't. Yeah, exactly. And back then, you would have to have if you were going to have a dinner party in your home, something like, what was aboard the Titanic, you would want to have a card receiver out at your front door, inside in the vestibule. And so when people would come in to call, they would leave their card to identify themselves. So card holders, the celery dishes were popular. It was very popular to serve fresh celery in a special dish just for celery back then. Punch bowls were kind of a thing. All the different linens we talk about in the book. So it's a really nice party guide for
Or a
movie
hostess
parties
gift. If you're
or a
going to
host.
a dinner party, that's a perfect gift to take.
You
Yes.
also talk about the Edwardian do's and don'ts, the way a gentleman must never wear his hat, and kissing the back of hands. There was a lot of that going on set with us. All the men immediately turned into Edwardian gentlemen, whether they were actors in costume or James Cameron. They would have to reach out for your hand. You'd have to put your hand forward and they'd kiss the back of your hand. It was like this natural feeling because of this natural want to just become very gentlemanly, because we were all dressed in such a stately manner. And we also, I don't know if you know this, but we had an etiquette coach all the time along with us. Her name was Lynn Hockney. She was actually a ballerina and a dancer, and she choreographed the third class dance sequences, but she was also with us the whole time to, doing the regular work from the outside in on the cutlery, which I've always thought is sort of a no-brainer. Just start from the small ones and work your way in. But
Well, that's what Molly told Jack.
they always have to mention that one. But everything, like here's an example. I had this beautiful little purse with me as part of my outfit, and I would sit down. They sat me next to the captain, to Bernard Hill, and we were very swiftly out of the shot, but we were passing, and so I sat next to Bernard, and my purse couldn't go on the table. Of course, I would put it on my lap, and I'd forget about it. But my silk skirt and this purse made of tiny little bits of chainmail, so to speak, would slide off my lap and onto the floor. And I'm like, Bernard, I'm sorry, can you pick up my purse again, please? And I catch Lynn's attention. I say, Lynn, is there any way I can hide it somewhere on the table so I don't have to keep forgetting about it and keep asking? She's like, no, you have to keep it very politely on your lap. But those are we had somebody who had delved into the history of this etiquette as well as you had, to constantly keep us on track so that we didn't make any Edwardian faux pas.
And you explain it so well, so many of the different things that were part of the culture back then, that you just explained it all so well. And there are many do's and don'ts.
Well,
my mother always told us that good manners were a tool to help you feel more comfortable and to help others feel more comfortable. It's not just some sort of strange society system. It's a tool to help you through life. Like good manners actually make you a better adult, I think, in some way.
And also at table they do. I know my mum, who actually has a very sort of working class background. She grew up in a council house and, educated herself, educated us. She was a stickler for using the right. I know Americans eat very differently to us. So we always have the fork in the left hand, knife in the right. And you had to hold your knife properly. You could not hold it like a pen. You had to hold, oh my gosh, she would go crazy. Part of her and if you think about it, growing up, in the Second World War, her parents grew up through the First World War. This trickled down that if you weren't from an educated background, the one way you could at least save yourself was at dinner by not eating with the wrong knife and fork in the wrong way. And then I came to the States and everyone cut their meat, put their knife down and picked up the meat with their fork in their right hand. And I was at first quite affronted. I was very young. And now I realize, that's the correct way that Americans like to eat in formal dining situations. Each country has their own way of doing things. And as Nelson said, it's as we're alluding to, it's kind of falling out of practice. People people have to learn to eat with chopsticks. That's
well, you have to learn how to eat with your phone in one hand and the fork in the other. I mean, it's one of those situations. Veronica, we very famously in a lot of the Titanic books, we see the menu from the last dinner, and there are Titanic parties and events where they recreate the menus. But your book, these are your creations. Is that correct? These are your recipes that you've created?
Yes, they are, every one of them, and tested several times. What you see behind me is the lamb chops, and this is for how the book is for, like I said, a party guide sort of book where you can think of things like past appetizers. This is the kind of lamb that you could have in your hand because it's on the bone, a little piece. So they're wonderful to have for your guests to just, pick one off a tray, put it on your plate with a little bit of, I have pea pesto, spring pea pesto, of course, because the menus were all spring with asparagus and lamb and so forth. And there's also a recipe for a mint sauce. And it's a bright, pretty green because there's food coloring in it. And
do you have replica Titanic White Star Line china that you serve on when you entertain?
I do not. The pictures that you see are from Inside Editions, from the food stylist and who took wonderful photographs. And these are the dishes from the photo shoot. But I don't have the replica dishes, and I really should get a set of one of the
We
dishes.
know a Titaniac.
We know a Titaniac. I know you've listened. Go back through our episodes and find Zach Douglas, who has, I believe, at the last count, 6 place settings of every plate, every knife, fork, spoon, crystal glasses. And I tease the heck out of him because I'm like, I am coming to Australia. We are finding the recipes, Zach, and we are making the food, and you invite your friends, and I will cook because I love to cook. And he goes apoplectic. He starts sweating, and the thought of it, no, well, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I love you to pieces, Alexandra, but I'm not. I said, you've got to use those plates and cups and dishes and glasses, please. We asked him to do a little B-roll for the documentary, like, just can you pour a little bit of wine into that? Pour a little bit of wine into the glass. It's that
you got to use it or lose it.
Use the best china. Use the best china. You must. That's what it's for.
But Veronica, you also have Titanic podcast history as well. You go beyond the food into the podcast world. So not just the written word, but the spoken word.
We produced a series when the first book came out, and it's wonderful, and it features all of the different, or several of the different topics, like the doctor who was the Titanic, stories about the baker, who was so beautifully depicted, Alexandra, in the movie, Charles Jochen.
Liam, yes.
He did wonderful. And so, yes.
Well, I think what we found is that we've been on other people's Titanic podcasts. They've been on our Titanic podcast. There's this beautiful cross-pollination of, and I think it's all sort of grown out of the 25th anniversary of the movie, my movie, which was finished and ready to sell in conjunction with our 25-year memory of that film coming out and sort of literally making such an impact on so many young people. A lot of the people that we interview or we've met were so young. They were 6 or 11 or 12 when they first saw this film, and just have grown into finding out more about the history, whether it's the costumes and the props or the history of the ship, or how many rivets, the rivet nerds. And we're going to have an explorer who's been down to the wreck. We're going to interview Parks Stevenson. So the breadth and the width and the depth of this story seems to be endless, and it's really such a joy for us to it's that idea of putting it out there, and it just all comes back to you.
And you are so, what an amazing blessing for you to have been part of that movie, because it's just legendary. I rarely watch a movie more than once, and I think I've watched Titanic 20 times. You know, it's just it's that movie. It just has
That and
everything.
Mommy Dearest. I mean, there are just some movies that you can watch over and over again. I don't know what it is. But tell me also, you do live event, like you take your show on the road and you can do live events and is it like lectures, party planning, consultations?
Well, it could, I mean, anything from a cooking demonstration like I provided on Thursday, just this week. I made some food for a class here in the town where I live in Wausau, Wisconsin. I made the Welsh rarebit that was on the lunch menu on April 12th that um, Elise Lurette saved her menu and she had crossed out Welsh rarebit. So I had to go down that path and figure out, okay, you know, how can we make a Welsh rarebit that Elise would love? So I made Welsh rarebit and the lamb that you see behind me, the salmon with mousseline sauce. And so I demonstrate recipes. We've had all sorts of different parties, like a movie party. Um, at one time we did. Recently, I had a wonderful gathering in Merrill where Dan Coxon is, where he was living when he sailed on the Titanic. And the mansion that he had been the caretaker of before he sailed on the Titanic had been raised, and several of the fireplace mantles and staircase balustrades and so forth were saved. Some of them were, and they're still at the museum. So I had a gathering on the anniversary this year where we talked about Dan and some of the building had become a convent at one time. So some of the sisters who had lived there came back and we all had a reunion. So we've done everything like from that to, you know, just different book parties, just getting together to have cocktail parties. And I love that we can get together and keep these stories alive through these gatherings
and eat
be
and drink
inspired.
and have nice full bellies in the process.
Yes.
What's the most fun dish for you to make from your Titanic culinary experience, and what's the most tricky one? Like what's the most labor intensive one, and then what's the maybe most fun one or user friendly?
Well, the most fun one that I love is the chartreuse jelly with peaches, which was dessert and in first class, and it's so pretty. You can really brighten it up with green food coloring, and it's really a cinch to make. You just use like, you know, your sure gel and some mint. I love mint. I love the way you can bring the flavors out from a fresh ingredient like mint. And then chartreuse, which is really hard to find these days. It's made by, do you say Carthusian monks?
It
It's
has that
so
very
hard to find.
distinct color. I mean, the color is chartreuse. It's almost as bright as the green of the peas behind you.
Yes, exactly. And then the peach, this I like to use clean peaches, which you could just buy a can of them. You don't have to do anything fancy with them. And it's just a beautiful presentation in a nice, pretty clear glass goblet with some fresh whipped cream and a nice big plunk of fresh mint on top. That I love to make that. Yeah, and as far
And
as
it's a labor
complicated,
intensive one. There's a really, yeah, you have to sort of spend all day or a few days thinking about making it.
well, I try not to do a lot of that, Alexandra. I always like to tell people there is a recipe that I'll share with you in a minute, but I'd like to tell people to think of ways to keep things simple. If you want to acknowledge the Titanic foods and stories, you can do things like have a cheese assortment that is the same cheese assortment that they had every day for lunch in first class. It was the same one on all the menus that I've seen for lunch. So you could do things like that. For complicated, I would say I wasn't real thrilled with how my sauce turned out for the salmon on Thursday night. It's
Was that the
separated.
mousseline? Is that what it
Yes,
was called? Yeah.
yes. And the mousseline sauce is like hollandaise sauce, but there's a difference. It's basically the same as hollandaise sauce, only with whipped cream, fresh whipped cream. folded in, okay, mixed
Oh no,
in.
that's way too many variables for me.
Yep,
I'd
and
be
you have to
very nervous.
separate
Yeah.
eggs. And,
I
yeah,
can
so
barely fold
that,
a shirt, let alone folding it into a recipe.
yeah, so I would say after Thursday night's experience, I would probably not want to do that again anytime too soon.
One thing,
Um,
this is something that you might enjoy a story. You know, Titanic won all the Oscars, and a bunch of us who played these supporting roles all sort of became in our own social circles. And somebody got wind of the fact that the Culinary Institute of America in the Valley was going to use the last menu on the Titanic as their graduation show. And I was like, oh, we got to get tickets for that, you know. And
yes.
all the men put on tuxedos, all the ladies found, you know, we found ball gowns. We didn't have our costumes, of course, but we dolled ourselves up as well as we could and rented limousines, and we did actually get to eat. And of course, they were tiny, lots of tiny, small plates. So by the time you'd finished, you were very full. But each plate came out and was presented. It was and somebody announced, you know, the history of the food of it and everything. So that was really a lovely way for us to keep celebrating the fact that we'd been in this spectacular film that so unexpectedly had been such a huge hit.
I hope you finished off the evening with the Leonardo di Cappuccino.
I'll say yes, we did. Yes, of course we did. And we
So,
didn't count. You see?
I see what you did there. I see what you did there. Now, Alexandra has the book in her hands. If you flip through and maybe show us one of the stills from the film. Yeah. So, Veronica, when you were art directing the book, what went into the decisions and choosing of the photographs? Did you interact with James Cameron at all in the building of the book?
My contributions were the recipes, and I did take photos of what I made. And the beautiful work that you see there in that book it was the direction of Inside Editions. And I'm so impressed. Isn't that nice?
Lovely.
And do you see any scenes in there that you recognize, Alexandra, from that you were involved in?
Well, I'm flicking now because like these cocktails and everything. Look at the cocktails.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting shot of Jack and Rose about to go into first class dining room, and the staircase below that is the staircase I walked up and down for 18 hours. They had like a 3-story replica of, you know, the top, that layer there where they are, and then down below that is where you'd walk into first class. And I trod those boards. I trod those treads for 18 hours for day one.
In a corset.
In a corset.
Wow. Well, that's another Veronica. But it must have been very difficult for the ladies, and they're all strapped into their corsets the way they were.
And they eat so much.
I like. We're used to, after COVID, we're used to eating in sweatpants all the time. Everything has an elastic band. So the ladies in those days, especially with the requisite etiquette involved, let alone the corsets, it must have been difficult to get a lot of food down.
Well, I think that's probably, you know, it definitely was motivation to, when you think of the corsets and the work to get into them. And I know that one of the things I learned in my research is that Molly Brown was actually a very petite woman, and I don't think she's depicted that way necessarily. And she was always working out and exercising, and she, you know, walked.
She was a frontier woman
on the Titanic. Yeah, yeah. And so, you know, she was actually what I would call tiny. So I know we think of these people that sat and ate, had these phenomenal meals, but they also took care of themselves. You know, they really weren't much different than we are today.
Is the portion size. I also heard that a lot of ladies would eat before dinner and then nibble and push their food around their plates to make it look like they were dainty eaters and dainty gentlewomen.
I wonder if anybody used the gymnasium on the Titanic other than the
You
trainer.
did.
But you speak about Molly Brown, and I remember the version of Titanic with Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb. They had a Molly Brown character, but they didn't call her Molly Brown, that Thelma Ritter played. I think they called her Maud, but it was the character. But it was really, in essence, the Molly Brown character who got out there and was rowing and was, playing cards with the men. And I was thinking about that when you mentioned the word game that they played on the Titanic, because in the films, I think in James Cameron's Titanic, we saw a kid playing with a top. We saw the kid playing with the top on the deck.
That's a reference to the Father
The
Brown
photograph.
images.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we've seen cards, and I think there was a game with they were playing dominoes or something in one film version. But that's really interesting. I love the word game. I'm keen to find out more about that. That also sounds like I'm a word game aficionado.
And just like cruise lines today, or when people go on cruises, you had to find ways to pass the time. There had to be entertainment of some description. So these parlor games, I'm sure everybody, and of course poker. Leo, once he'd learned to play poker for his winning the ticket scene, he would bring cards to the Real Del Mar where we'd all be drinking our famously drinking our margaritas, and he wanted to keep playing poker, but we all wanted to sing traditional folk songs, so he didn't get, I think he had one or two takers, but mostly we were singing songs with Brian who played the pipes in Gaelic Storm.
You're going to want to, Veronica, after this conversation, you're going to want to go back and rewatch James Cameron's Titanic again. I always feel that way after we speak to one of our guests. It's like, there's always something new to notice or analyze or think about. And that leads me to a question for you, Alexandra. Because you were in that dinner party scene for however many days it took to shoot all of that, did you at any point get to eat? And if so, what did they serve you to stand in for?
We did. Yes,
the fair?
We did. They brought around pâté de foie gras, which was on a little plate, and it had a tiny little piece of sort of garnish on it or something. And I remember them sort of taking it away because they had to serve it again, and taking it away and serving it again. So you got,
by the end of the day, that wouldn't have been so
they
good.
They all had a sort of thin film of dust over them because they had been sort of sitting off to the side in the props area. That was pretty obvious. I looked at the menu sitting in front of me on the table, and in that beautiful menu holder, which I still want one so badly, the star-shaped clip with the menus sat in. Oh my gosh, if that fit in my long glove, that would be on my desk right now, but it wouldn't. Yes, we did. We ate pâté de foie gras very daintily and sort of very pretendingly.
Sparingly, I would think, yes. Veronica, what's next? What's the next thing on your to-do list?
Well, right now, I'm just having a really wonderful time sharing these stories as this book just came out. And of course, my first book just came out in paperback in the spring. So working on a lot of really great things like this talk tonight. And then I have 2 books coming out next year that I can't really tell a whole lot of detail about yet, but I can tell you that they are culinary based, and they're going to be very interesting, and I'm having a lot of fun putting the finishing touches on them and double checking recipes and making sure everything works together. So
I have had so much fun talking to you. I am going to make the first recipe I'm going to make is Eton mess, because I love me an Eton mess. It's very English and it makes me think of English summer times. Because the last
I want a cocktail. You stick with the food, I'll stick with the beverage.
Well, the last one I tried to make was a disaster. The meringue was like a flat brown cow pat when it came out. I've never been so embarrassed by a meringue in my life, because I've never had a problem with them before, but they're just the
words I have never uttered.
The meringue gods were against me that day. So I'm going to go for the proper recipe this time and use it from your book.
And the next time we're in Wisconsin, we expect a dinner invitation.
Or we all have to go to Australia and make Zach
and eat on Zach's plates.
Oh.
Well, Veronica, as you said earlier in the episode, everybody's dream was to get on the ship and go to New York City. Well, that's where I am. So you let me know next time you're in New York City, and I won't make you cook. I'll buy you dinner.
Thank you so much.
We'll all get on your website, check out your book.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. To celebrate Season 2 of Titanic Talk, we've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop.